Welcome to Russian History Retold, Episode 318, Patriarchs and Metropolitans of the Russian Orthodox Church, Part 2. Last time, we covered the early Metropolitans and the first Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, the future Saint Job. Today, we will discuss the most influential of the remaining leaders of the Russian Church, all the way up to the present-day Patriarch, the very controversial Kirill. The first Patriarch we will discuss is one whose place is disputed by some within the Russian Orthodox Church. Some even omit him from their list as he tried to legitimize the first false Dmitri during the time of troubles. Ignatius is controversial for several reasons. First, he performed the coronation of false Dmitri I on July 21st, 1605. This was popular with some in Moscow, but certainly not with many in the church. When the first false Dmitri was assassinated on May 17, 1606, Ignatius was forcibly removed from the see and sent to the Chudov monastery prison. Then he backed a second false Dmitri. Ignatius would escape Moscow only to be attacked, beaten, and robbed at the Polish border. His life, though, was spared by the Polish king Sigismund III Vasa, who thought he would be of use if he were able to invade Muscovy and take control of the country. To add to his controversial nature, Ignatius converted to Byzantine Rite Catholicism, which got him a post-mortem damnatio memoria, which is why he is often not counted among the legitimate patriarchs by the Russian Orthodox Church. His successor, Hermogenes, was staunchly opposed to the first false Dmitri, which caused him to be exiled for a brief period until he returned in 1606. Tsar Vasily IV Shuisky would help him get elected as the next true patriarch. Hermogenes would oppose the Polish army's attempt to take control of Moscow. This led to his being sent to the prison at the Chudov monastery. From there, he would bless the Russian uprising led by Kuzma Minin and Prince Pozarsky. This would lead to his being beaten and starved to death. Patriarch Hermogenes would be canonized as a saint and as a hero martyr, a martyr who was once a priest or bishop, in 1913. We have talked about Hermogenes' successor a few times in the past. His patriarchal name was Filaret, but his birth name is a little bit more familiar. Fyodor Nikitich Romanov. He was the father of the first Romanov Tsar, Mikhail. His career in service to the state began under Tsar Fyodor I, who was also his cousin. Fyodor would be a valuable asset to the throne as both a diplomat and soldier. He was held in high esteem, and he was considered a successor to Fyodor after his death. But Boris Godunov would have none of that and forced Fyodor and his wife, Zhenya Shestova, to take monastic vows under the names of Filaret and Martha. Filaret would remain a captive at the Antoniev monastery in the Russian north, where he would be treated like a common thief. The first false Dmitri, though, would release him and make him Metropolitan of Rostov. The second false Dmitri would actually make him Patriarch of all Russia, but that election was kind of questionable. From 1610 to 1618, Filaret was a prisoner in the hands of the Polish king, Sigismund III Vasa, who refused to acknowledge him as the rightful king of Russia. Filaret was freed with the signing of the Truce of Dulino on February 13, 1619, and officially enthroned as Patriarch of Moscow and all of Russia on June 24th. From then on, the country was considered a diarchy, ruled by two people. That would be Filaret and his son Michael, who would run the government, although it was clear that the father was the actual power broker. Filaret's most important domestic decision was to solidify the notion that the serfs were tied to the land for good. There was a period of migration from those areas controlled by the government to the steppes, many joining the Cossack hosts, as we told you about in the Cossack series. Filaret would significantly increase the power of the church in civil and some criminal matters. According to Simon Sebag Montefiore, the Patriarchate under Filaret would be crucial in establishing the Romanov dynasty through his use of ornate ceremonies and architectural projects. These would create an aura around the Tsar, particularly the Romanov family. Filaret's other achievement would be the modernization of the Russian army through his hiring of English and Scottish mercenaries. His successor would be one of his choosing, Joasiphus, who was ordained patriarch in 1634. His patriarchate, which lasted for 6 years, was pretty much nondescript. Joasiphus avoided meddling in Russian affairs, not even advising the Tsar. After his death in 1640, the seat was empty until the election of Patriarch Joseph in 1642. Joseph was another nondescript patriarch, except for one thing. He ordered the publication of instructions to Orthodox priests and laypersons. While only a small percentage of Russians could read at the time, this was an important step in making them better educated. Another critical decision under Joseph was calling together a church council to clean up the mess within the church regarding the services and rituals. This was really heavily pushed by the Metropolitan of Novgorod, Nikon, who would become Joseph's successor in 1652. Nikita Minin, ordained as Patriarch Nikon on August 1st, 1652, was one of the most controversial and important patriarchs in Russian Orthodox history. He headed the reform movement, leading to the most significant schism in Russian Orthodox Church history. Coming from a broken family, the future patriarch would run away from home at the age of 12 to live at the Makareyev monastery. Returning to his hometown, his family convinced him to get married. His wife would bear him 3 children, all of whom would die young. Nikita would have his wife take the veil, allowing him to become a monk residing in a small hermitage on the Isle of Anzersky on the White Sea. Nikon moved to several different monasteries over the years, but while staying at the Novospassky Monastery, he became a member of something called the Circle of the Zealots of Piety. This group included several influential men, including the man who would eventually become his greatest enemy, Protopope Avakum Petrov. In 1649, Nikon was made the Metropolitan of Novgorod, but he got on the wrong side of the people early on. Their dislike of him was so great that he was attacked and severely beaten during a riot. While he was able to control the situation, there was no way he could remain much longer. In 1652, Nikon was elected to be Patriarch of Moscow. This was not a popular decision amongst the boyar class, and Nikon knew it. Due to his shrewd political machinations, he was able to get the boyars under his thumb. This allowed him to begin reforming the Russian Orthodox Church's church service books and many of the traditions handed down from the church in Constantinople and modified over the years. Nikon attacked those who differed from his ideas and even had soldiers and some of his servants go house to house to deface icons that he viewed as heretical. This led to great hatred of him by many in Moscow, and his list of enemies would grow each year. Nikon's powers continued to grow as he became closer to Tsar Alexis. This culminated in his control of Moscow in 1654, while the Tsar was away during one of his wars with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The resentment of the trust in Nikon led to his eventual break from his relationship with the Tsar. For years, the Synod and Alexis tried to remove him from his position with little luck, even when Nikon left Moscow. The Synod's bickering and difficulty with Nikon ended in December 1667, when he was tried by a council of, quote, 2 foreign patriarchs, 13 Metropolitans, 9 Archbishops, 5 Bishops, and 32 Archimandrites. On December 12, 1667, the Synod pronounced Nikon guilty of reviling the Tsar and of the whole Muscovite Church, of deposing Paul, Bishop of Coloma, contrary to the canons, and of beating and torturing his dependents." Unquote. He would be stripped of his vestments and sent to the far northern Ferenpontov monastery. Interestingly enough, though, all of his reforms were approved by the very same synod, and his opponents, especially Protopope Avvakum, were anathematized. Nikon would be allowed to return to Moscow by Alexis's son Fyodor, but unfortunately for the former patriarch, he would die on his way to Yaroslavl on August 17, 1681. If you can even call him that, Nikon's successor was Petrim. He was considered an interim patriarch while Nikon was under investigation. Joasiphus II would hold the patriarchate between 1667 and 1672, but there is little in the historical record of him accomplishing much of anything. Petrim would pop up again for a year before he passed away in 1673. Joachim was elected patriarch in 1674 and led the church for 16 years, continuing to enforce Nikon's reforms and the persecution of the old believers after the Raskol, or schism within the Russian Orthodox Church. Patriarch Adrian, the one next in line, would be appointed in 1690. His patriarchate would be the last one until 1917. Adrian would clash with the new Tsar Peter I over his Reformation demands. Peter wanted the church out of state affairs, something that Adrian would not stand for. With the patriarch's death in 1700, Peter abolished the post and replaced it with the most holy governing synod, which would be led by Stefan Yavorsky until his death in 1722. The Holy Synod would consist of 11 people, then 12 men, some of whom were laypersons, others clerics, including the Metropolitans of St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev, and the Exarch of Georgia. Its name would be officially changed to the Most Holy All-Ruling Synod. It would rule over the Russian Orthodox Church for the following 2 centuries. Since we have no patriarchs to discuss for a while, and the Metropolitan of Moscow was only nominally in charge of church matters, it's time to rev up the time machine and forward it to the tumultuous year of 1917. To say that the first patriarch in almost 200 years had a hard time during his stay as the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church would be a massive understatement. The future Saint Tikhon would be a world traveler in the years prior to his taking position in the Patriarchate. Tikhon's first major appointment after becoming a monk was as the Bishop of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. He would actually become a naturalized American citizen in the early 20th century. On May 22, 1901, in his expanded role in the United States, he blessed the cornerstone of St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City. This would become the headquarters of Rokor, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. It was the church where I was baptized and where my family would attend services until 1973. It still exists on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. After becoming an archbishop based in New York City, Tikhon returned to Russia in 1907 to take over the See of Yaroslavl. In 1913, he would be transferred to the Diocese of Vilno in Lithuania. With Russia reeling from the revolutions and turmoil in 1917, Tikhon was appointed first as the ruling bishop of Moscow on June 21st, then elevated to Metropolitan on August 14th, and finally, on October 28, 1917, he was elected to be the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, just a few days after the Bolsheviks took control of the government in St. Petersburg. Of course, the church was staunchly opposed to the Bolsheviks and the idea of communism. This would lead to the imprisonment and sometimes execution of a large number of the clergy. Tikhon, in 1918, denounced the murder of the Tsar's family, which brought more condemnation from the new rulers of Russia. Seeing things going poorly for the White Army in 1920, Tikhon would grant autonomy to the Russian Orthodox churches outside of Russia. This schism would last from 1921 until 2007, when formal relations with the Moscow Church would be reestablished. Tikhon would be placed under house arrest between April 1922 and June 1923. He would then release a statement, presumably under pressure, stating that he was, quote, no longer an enemy to the Soviet power. Later that year, he was released from his position by a Soviet-sponsored council of the so-called Living Church, something that was never acknowledged by the real church. Tikhon would die of an illness in 1924, but many believe that he was likely poisoned or, most likely, died of a broken heart. His successor would be Peter of Krutitz, who would serve as a temporary patriarch. His term would begin in April 1925 and then end in December of the same year. Much of the rest of his life would be either spent in prison or exile until his execution on October 10, 1937. His successor, who was his deputy, was Sergius, who would be a highly controversial patriarch, to say the very least. Sergius declared that the church would be totally devoted to the Soviet government. In an epistle sent to the pastors of the church, he wrote in 1927, quote, we need to show, not in words, but in deeds, that not only those who are indifferent to Orthodox Christianity, not only those who have betrayed it, but also its most zealous adherents, for whom it is as dear as truth and life, with all its dogmas and traditions, with all its canonical and liturgical structure, can be faithful citizens of the Soviet Union, loyal to the Soviet government. We want to be Orthodox and at the same time recognize the Soviet Union as our civil motherland, whose joys and successes are our joys and successes, and whose failures are our failures. Any blow directed at the Union, be it a war, a boycott, some kind of social disaster, or just a murder from around the corner, like the Warsaw one, is recognized by us as a blow directed at us. Many have claimed that this was a betrayal of the Russian Orthodox Church, but others say that he did this to stop the brutal treatment that was being dealt out to the clergy and believers at the time. I have to say, after doing all my extensive research, that the evidence actually points to the latter, something that cannot always be said of those that followed him. Sergius would officially be named patriarch in 1943 when Stalin desperately needed the church to back him in a post-Nazi invasion of the USSR. Sergius, though, would die on May 15, 1944. Patriarch Alexius I would become a vassal of the Soviet Union, and in particular to Joseph Stalin. When Stalin passed in 1953, here is what Alexius would say, quote, his death is a heavy grief for our fatherland and for all the people who inhabit it. The whole Russian Orthodox Church, which will never forget his benevolent attitude to church needs, feels great sorrow at his death. Our church proclaims eternal memory to him with a special feeling of abiding love. Now, there are numerous claims that Alexius was a KGB agent in disguise, but, like Sergius, many believe that he was trying to protect what he could of the church. In 1959, Nikita Khrushchev resumed the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church. Others claim that he was hindered in his ability to fight back against the onerous limits of the church due to the proliferation of government agents within the church hierarchy. When Alexius passed away in 1970, he was replaced with Pimen I. His reign as patriarch was uninspired, as he was trying to just stay alive and keep what little was left of the church. Still, he was there when the collapse of the Soviet Union was beginning, as the Communist Party's stranglehold on the suppression of the Russian Orthodox Church was waning. Pimen would pass away in 1990, just before the end of the USSR. His successor, Alexei II, became the first patriarch after the fall of the communist-led government 18 months after his election. There are very strong hints that he was a KGB agent undermining Patriarch Alexius I. There is ample evidence to support this allegation. Between his elevation to the Patriarchate and his death in 2008, Alexius II promoted a very conservative agenda. His ire was directed at homosexuality, the Catholic Church, and many liberal movements. He did push for the canonization of many who suffered under the communist government. Alexius was also at the forefront of the glorification of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. The pinnacle of his reign was 2007 with the reunification of the Moscow Patriarchate with the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. Given his supposed activities as a KGB agent, this remains a sticking point with many in the Church in the United States. We now end the patriarchal line of the Russian Orthodox Church in 2024 with the current leader, Kirill. As this is a history podcast, I will only briefly touch on his reign, which is highly controversial and pushes the limits of hypocrisy that one can do in a position as the head of a religion. It is estimated that Kirill has amassed a wealth in excess of $4 billion. He is a staunch ally and, one might say, an aide to Vladimir Putin's autocratic rule. His public appearance with a $35,000 Rolex watch certainly raises a lot of eyebrows. History will judge his time as a leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, something I am not ready to do so yet. Well, I hope you enjoyed this short 2-part series. Join me next time when we start a new 3-part series covering the history of the 3 great cities of Russia: Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev. So, until next time, до свидания и спасибо за внимание.